So first of all, congratulations on finishing all of Julius Caesar, and even greater congratulations for reading 2.5 acts of Shakespeare completely on your own with very minimal help from your teacher. I had my doubts about how this was all going to work when we started doing this. I was like, oh my gosh, how in the world am I supposed to teach Shakespeare online? But as you guys already showed me when we read Romeo and Juliet, you guys do get this stuff and you understand it. And yeah, Caesar's a little bit more complicated than Romeo and Juliet, where it's not about teenagers who are stupid and falling in love with each other, but it's about these political motivations and like why they do this and why they do that. And should I really kill the guy? Should I not kill the guy? Is this worth it? Like, is this going to be better for Rome? Is this better for me? Why am I even considering if it's for me? You know, there's these bigger, complex questions that the play deals with, especially from the mind of Brutus. But you guys have managed to make it work. And from what I've seen on your actively learned responses, most of you are really getting this. And so that's awesome. So this is going to be a brief plot summary of what's been going on, just so I can make sure that you guys are understanding the play itself, or just at least from a plot perspective, and then I'll try to dive in on some of the deeper issues that are present in there. But hopefully this will not take too long, and we will just jump into this right away and see where we can go. So let me jump into the presentation here, and we'll go from there. So we're here, and I need to present this, and here we go. Okay, so well, I already went over this, but Act 4 basically starts off with the formation of the second triumvirate, with that being Mark Antony Lepidus and Octavian, who of course is Caesar's nephew and who will be the next Caesar. They assume control of the military and they start deciding who's going to live, who's going to die. One of you asked, what does it mean when they're pricking people down? That just means they have a list of names and they're literally like pricking, oh, you live, you die. Hey, you okay if your brother dies? Yeah, if your brother dies, and oh, okay, that's fine. So that's, or your nephew dies. It's Antony has someone he also offers up to be dead because he was on the side of the conspirators. So that's basically what happens there, and it's just showing the reality of this war and how harsh it has to be. And then we move on to the next scene, which I know that you guys noticed this in your stuff, but sometimes this scene is divided into two separate scenes. Sometimes it's kept as one scene depending on the text that you're reading. But for our purposes, we're going to count it as just Act 4, Scene 2. I think Actively Learn split it into some different scenes, but for our purposes, it is all one scene. It starts off on the battlefield outside of a tent, and then it moves into a tent. And the move into a tent is often seen as a different scene, and that's kind of how I see it. But for our purposes, according to what we read, we'll keep it all as one complete thing. Regardless, this is a big fight between Cassius and Brutus. So first, they come in and they're arguing about stuff, and Brutus is like, let's take this inside so that we're not arguing in front of the men. And Cassius is like, all right. So he comes in and he accuses Brutus of taking, or he had previously, before all this went down, had accused Brutus of taking bribes when they were on the Senate together. And then Cassius receives the same insult from Brutus because it's like, you have an itching palm. You're itching to get money out of this because you just, killed one of your men for taking bribes, and you're doing the very same thing. And that leads Brutus to this issue in his head because he identifies this as corruption within Cassius, and that's not a good thing. And then Brutus begins to question whether the assassination was actually worth it or not. Did we destroy the ambition and the corruption just to replace it with ambition and corruption again? And he continues this by saying, remember March, the Ides of March, remember, did not great Julius bleed for justice' sake? What villain touched his body that did stab, and not for justice? What shall one of us that struck the foremost man of all this world, but for supporting robbers, shall we now contaminate our fingers with base bribes and sell the mighty space of our large honors for so much trash as may be grasped thus? I had rather be a dog and bay the moon than such a Roman. And basically what he's saying on all of this is like, we made Julius bleed for the sake of justice, for the sake of an honorable government. We wanted to reinstitute justice and freedom and get rid of tyranny. And you're displaying every bit of that by doing all this bribery stuff. You're contaminating your fingers with bad blood. If we contaminated our fingers earlier with blood, but that was for a good reason. That was a good cause. Good cause. This is not a good cause because you're doing everything that we swore against and what we were trying to replace. And then he does the worst thing and equates it to, we have this large honor, but it's basically we've become trash if are recognized by these bribes. This is scandalous. This is not right, Cassius. What are you doing? And so Cassius gets all upset about this, and he's like, "Well, you killed Julius. You want to kill me too?" And he gets down on his knees and like rips his shirt open. He says, "Take my dagger. Kill me too." Dramatic, isn't it? Like Cassius lost his mind. He's like, "Well, you can just kill me like you did Caesar. Is that what you want to do?" It's like two little schoolgirls, just no offense, just going back and forth at each other. And then he's like, and then like somehow they all make up and then they're hugging each other and calling each other brother and saying how much they love and respect one another. And I'm just like, children, gosh, it's ridiculous. But anyway, and it's also really interesting that these two men who were supposed to be so stoic and are supposed to be the pinnacle and the epitome of what a Roman stoic is, are being so emotional. And one of them's like, "Well, just kill me, why don't you?" And the other one's rattling off of these emotional rants about justice and freedom and all this stuff. And he's like screaming his head off basically at each other. And I'm like, y'all are supposed to be emotionless. You remember that, right? What are you doing here? But anyway, there's deeper reasons for all of that, but that's just how I see it, and that's how you should see it. They're being petty schoolgirls with all of the stuff that they're fighting about. But Brutus is touching on some rather big issues in the process. And of course, this is what Cassius says when he is down on the ground with his shirt ripped open, handing Brutus the dagger. He says, "Strike as thou didst at Caesar. For I know when thou didst hate him worst, thou lovest him better than ever thou lovest Cassius." And Cassius, basically what he's saying here is, bro, you love Julius more than you love me, and you even hated him. And even though you hated him, you still loved him more than you hate me, and you haven't killed me yet. And I'm just like, what are you doing? Stop. I've got a war happening, and you're fighting over who loves each other more. Oh gosh, it's just like I don't get it. It's like I think that Shakespeare is trying to show that regardless of everything that's happened, they're losing their minds. Clearly, they've got some big issues they're dealing with right here, and it's just like, what is happening? But anyway, and it's a bold statement on Cassius's part. But anyway. So they make up and they're hugging each other. And then Cassius notices like Brutus, "Are you okay now? Like we made up. Are you all right?" And he's like, "My wife died." And then Cassius just like starts bawling. Basically, I mean, he's not really, but like he gets really emotional and he's like, "What is happening? Like, she died?" And then like they cry about it together, basically. And Cassius had a lot of respect for Portia because of how intelligent she was and how smart she was. And then Brutus is a mess because he's just now able to relieve these emotions because he's there with one of his trusted friends, with Cassius, so they can be emotional together. Even though, I just ran it on them for because they're supposed to be Roman Stoics, the whole Stoicism thing is supposed to happen in public. In private, even though it's looked down upon, it's okay because nobody's going to know. And that's another issue for another day. But basically, they're having their own, crying party for Portia. But what's interesting here is after the fact, when the other men come back into the tent to let them know what's happening and they can see the other armies advancing and stuff, they immediately, Brutus, because Cassius has basically gotten over it, but Brutus immediately shuts it off. And I wish that I could show you guys a good enough scene, and I couldn't find one, but like they're both like Brutus is still crying and like is very emotional over the death of his wife, and these other men come in and it's like instant light switch off. I'm now a Roman Stoic. I'm not crying anymore. Like there's no tears on my face. And it's like such a quick change. The last production I saw of Caesar was fascinating in the way that they did this. because then these men come in and relate to Brutus that Portia has died. And of course he knows how, because she stuffed coals in her mouth, or she swallowed fire, is what they say. Pretty grisly death, honestly. And he shuts it off like that because he has to be a Roman Stoic, because by not showing his emotions, he's giving this image of strength and courage amidst everything, because if he's not strong for his men, everything's going to fall apart quicker than it does, but everything's going to fall apart anyway. And then so everybody tries to go to sleep. He asks Lucius to play some music on his guitar, or on his little lyre, or I don't know what it is exactly. It depends on the production, but I forget what it says in the actual script. But Lucius has an instrument, and he's playing a lullaby for everybody. And then so they fall asleep. And then Brutus is awakened, excuse me. It's awakened by or he hasn't fallen asleep yet, but he sees that a candle's doing something weird, and he comments on that. And then he sees the ghost of Caesar. And he recognizes that it's Caesar because it looks like Caesar. Now, of course, we're not sure whether he's awake or asleep right now. We don't know if Caesar is actually there or if Brutus is just going crazy. Most of Shakespeare's characters at this point, when they go crazy, things happen, like seeing ghosts or hallucinating. So this is a common thing that Shakespeare does, but it's very unclear right here whether the ghost is real or not. But I think we're supposed to think that the ghost is real. That's just how I see it. You can determine that on your own according to how you see stuff. But it's really interesting that, as terrifying as this ghost is, as you guys saw in the clip that you watched, this ghost only says two things. Brutus asks it who it is. He knows it's Caesar, but the ghost says, "Thy evil spirit, Brutus." And that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Thy evil spirit, Brutus, meaning I am a ghost that is haunting you, so I am therefore your evil spirit that's haunting you. Thy evil spirit, meaning I am a representation of the evil part of you, Brutus. Or just, I'm representing that side of you for what you did to me. Which leads credit to the idea that it is a hallucination, that his brain has created this thing for him to see, to deal with his emotions and stuff. But then it could just be the ghost saying, I'm a ghost and I'm mad because you killed me, and I am therefore evil because I'm coming after you. And so there's a variety of ways of looking at this, and it's very ambiguous. And honestly, the uncertainty of this actually lends to the suspense and the horror that Brutus is feeling, because we don't know why the ghost is there. And then the other thing it says is, "Thou shalt see me at Philippi," which is it's a nearby place, and there's going to be a battle go down there. And then so Brutus gets really wary of this. He's like, I'm going to see this ghost again. But we'll get to that when we get to that. And so we move on into Act 5, and Act 5 goes by super quick. It's the end of the play, but like I said, after, Antony gives his big speech, it's like the miles per hour on the play just gets cranked up in each scene. Like we're running at 160 mph right here, because it's so quick. You guys read those short little scenes that were only like 6 lines a piece, and it's just and it's really cool how it stays sometimes, because you'll have these long talky scenes, and then you'll have a battle scene, and they'll say 6 things, they're fighting each other, and then we'll move into another scene, and then there'll be another scene come in, and they'll say 6 things, and they'll fight each other, and then we go into something else. It's just super quick, because there's a war going on, and things are got to wrap up because we're in Act 5, and so we're getting to the end here, and it's really quick. We're running at breakneck speed here, and so I'm going to try to do that as well, getting through this. So with the second triumvirate, there's this argument that happens with Antony and Octavian Caesar about, Antony says, I'm going to take the right flank and you're going to take the left flank. And then Octavian is like, no, you're going to take the left, I'm going to take the right, because left is associated with bad luck to the Romans, and right is associated with good luck. And Octavian notices that. And it's also rather interesting because Antony begins to call Octavian Caesar, just to, not because he was related to Caesar, but because, he's recognizing that Octavian is going to have all that power when this is over, so we might as well start calling him that. And also, remember in the beginning of everything at the Lupercal festival, when Caesar gave Antony the instructions to, make sure that the baton hits Calpurnia so she can conceive a child? Remember, that's how all that worked. believed that happened. If they got hit with the meat stick, they would, or the wolf meat stick, they would get pregnant later on. It was like a fertility thing. And so Antony says, when Caesar says this, it is done. And so recognizing that idea, this happens again because Caesar has said something, so it's done, and there's no cause for argument. And so he just lets it happen because he's Caesar. He has to recognize that. Caesar is a divine god, basically, with the power to rule over all of Rome. And so Antony recognizes that. And it's just a really interesting little thing, and I'm probably making more of it than necessary, but it was notable enough to point out. Now, and then we switch focus to Cassius and Brutus. Brutus and Cassius both remark, or Cassius first remarks, that he would prefer to die than become a prisoner in Rome as a result of all of this. And Brutus basically echoes that in the same way. And so what happens is, when we're focusing on Cassius, he is there with his friend Lucilius, who's one of his other soldiers. And honestly, Lucilius is probably Cassius's best friend, as what happens later on. And so he sends Lucilius off to go, take care of things. Or it's Titinius. I get these names mixed up all the time. Titinius is his best friend. Please ignore what I just said. So Titinius goes off, and they're like up. Cassius and Pindarus are up on a hill, and they can see what's happening. And so they see Titinius go over there to the other opposing army, and it's a ways off. Like, we're talking like it's enough distance they can see a crowd of people, but they can't really make out what's actually happening. And of course, this isn't staged that way because it's just them on stage, and they're like creating the scene for the audience by pointing out and looking out over them and everything. But Titinius is captured, seeing how, that's what he's engulfed by a group of people. And so they misinterpret this, and then Cassius is basically like, I've lost my best friend now. This isn't worth happening. And what he does is he asks Pindarus to take his sword and kill him. And it's very interesting because Cassius covers his eyes so he can't see the sword coming, and asks Pindarus to actually take the sword and kill him. And this is the same sword, the same dagger that was used to kill Caesar. As Cassius remarks, Caesar, thou art revenged, even with the sword that killed thee. But this is a fatal mistake on Cassius's part, because Titinius wasn't actually captured. That was Brutus's army or Brutus's legion that Cassius saw, and when they saw the screams were screams of happiness because it was one of their own men. But Cassius misinterpreted that, and like when they crowded around him to hug him and welcome him back in, he saw that as them engulfing him and actually killing him. And so Cassius knew that he would be next, or assumed that he would be next, so he goes ahead and kills himself in a very cowardly fashion. But I'll touch on that in a second. Now, meanwhile, or at the same time, over with Brutus's, with where he's at with his section of men, even though this is part of the same army, they send Lucilius out to do some recon and to tell him if he's captured to act as Brutus and to pose as Brutus. And so he fakes out, and they end up killing him. And this is to this is to mirror what just happened here, except this actually happened in the right way because it's not misinterpreted in how this goes down. And so that all goes down, and then Brutus notices that after Lucilius is killed by the triumvirate's forces, things are looking really bleak. And he has this remark about seeing Caesar on the battlefield, just as the ghost said he would. It's really interesting that he says that he sees that, but what I think we're supposed to get out of that is he feels the loss coming. He knows he's going to lose. So what he does is, looking at the men that are there with him, he recognizes the inevitable, that this isn't going to work, because he's already found Cassius's body at this point. He's like, we're done. This is effectively over. He recognizes the inevitable. He feels Caesar's presence from beyond the grave, if you will. and Caesar's continued influence over all of these events, because they did see Caesar as a divine person. And so, maybe he's operating from beyond the grave or whatever. Load of hogwash, but, that's just how they saw it. And so basically what he does is he asks his men there to take the sword of his, and that he will run into it. This is really interesting because Cassius asked for the sword to be slashed against him with his eyes covered. How this is typically staged is the character that's holding the sword of Brutus's typically looks away. And then Brutus, as it says in the text, runs into the sword and impales himself. This is meant to illustrate that Brutus is a far more honorable man. Because of this death, he is not a coward like Cassius at all. Now, I'm not saying that he has a better suicide and that this suicide is better than the other one because this is an honorable one. There's nothing honorable in suicide. The Romans were jacked up in the way they saw stuff, but it was tradition that if they knew that they were going to die, it was more honorable to take their own life than to be killed by the enemy. That's just how they saw things. It was their culture. It's their honor culture and how they saw stuff. But suicide's wrong anyway. Just wanted to get that out of there. But the biggest thing here is that right before he runs into the sword, he recognizes that all of this was not for a good enough reason. Because earlier in the play, he's weighing the pros and cons of everything. He's coming up with these ridiculous arguments about why he should do it or why he shouldn't do it. And the arguments make less and less sense as he goes on, but he can't see that because he's trying to operate purely by logic. And by removing the emotional context of it, he only becomes more logical and more cold. And here, I think he realizes that. He realizes that because of his decision, all of this has happened. This effectively is his anagnorisis moment, that term that y'all have learned recently about when the tragic hero recognizes that it's his fault for all the suffering that has happened over the course of the play. And ultimately, Brutus was the final person to join the conspiracy. And he was one of the organizers of it after the fact. He was a leader of it, even though he was the last one to join. Without him, without his support, this wouldn't have happened because Cassius wouldn't have went through with it had he not had Brutus's support and had Brutus not been a member of it. So what Brutus says here, I killed not thee with half so good a will. In other words, I wasn't even 50% sure when I killed you. If only he had recognized that and had considered his emotions instead of his logic when he decided to do this, things might have turned out differently for him. But he is seen as this honorable figure because when Mark Antony rolls up onto the scene, Mark Antony says, this was the noblest Roman of them all. And just to show you guys the other thing that he says, just to read it to you because I want you to hear this. He says, all the conspirators save only he did that they did in envy of great Caesar. In other words, all the conspirators other than Brutus killed Caesar because they envied him. They wanted his power, which is 100% accurate because that's what Cassius wanted. Remember when we looked at that temptation scene and Cassius based all of his, argument off of the fact that Brutus should be this nobleman because Brutus is already seen as this nobleman by all of Rome? And then he says, he only in a general, honest thought and common good to all made one of them. Basically, he did all of this honestly for the common good of Rome. He truly believed that what he was doing would create a better Rome for everyone, a Rome free of tyranny. He continues, his life was gentle and the elements so mixed in him, the things that, created him, the inner workings of his soul were so perfectly mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man, a perfect Roman, because he believed that what he was doing was for the greater good. This is how Antony sees it. These are the last words that he speaks in the play. And of course, it all ends with Octavius saying, "We'll take him to my tent. He'll sleep there tonight. We'll give him an honorable, we'll give him an honorable burial like a soldier." And that's basically where the play ends. Octavius says, "So call the field to rest and let's away to part the glories of this happy day." And of course, it's happy for Octavius because that boy is about to become Caesar. And we're right back where we started. The conspiracy was a failure. It didn't do anything other than install another dictator. But that's not what Shakespeare's concerned with. Shakespeare is concerned with honor and with corruption and whether or not it was right for Brutus to do what Brutus did. And ultimately, because of how things end and because of how Brutus is somewhat redeemed through his honorable suicide, if you will, I think Shakespeare is basically showing that, things may look terrible on the political side of things, but that doesn't mean that we should kill our leaders, because it won't do anything. It'll only make problems worse, or we'll just, operate in a cycle. There was a lot of stuff going on in Elizabethan or in the Renaissance when this was written. There was a lot of political instability. There were people who were, concerned with who the monarch actually was and whether the monarch should be removed and all of this stuff. And I'm not going to go into that, but it did influence why he wrote this. He's basically saying, don't kill your leaders. It's not a good idea. The Public Theater, it's an off-Broadway theater in New York City, recently did a production of Julius Caesar a few years ago, in which their Caesar was portrayed to look like President Trump. Okay, very bold choice on their part. And then the public came under fire because they were depicting the assassination of a sitting president. And that didn't set well with people, even in a state that, leans very left on the political spectrum. That still didn't set well with people. And for good reason, because they were calling for the assassination of a president. But the public, regardless of what their intent was, did something amazing, because they wrote a public letter basically, and they said, "Did you not watch the play? Do you not see what happens when political leaders are killed? Did you not pay attention?" Pretty effective answer. And I think that is what Shakespeare is ultimately getting at in this play. And of course, it's influenced by honor and some other things, but you guys will be discussing that in the essay you're going to be working on, which you should see the second video for that. But other than that, that is the end of Julius Caesar. So I will get your guys' stuff graded very soon. And let's jump into the next video and talk about this essay that you're going to be working on.